Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten Frontier. I'm your host, Mehdi, and I'm here today with my co-host, Idham.
Hey, everyone.
Today, we are exploring how, for early settlers in Canada, the wilderness was both an untamed force that threatened survival and an envisioned land ripe for transformation.
Yeah, we're looking at two literary works that capture these perspectives, A Journey into the Woods and The Rising Village.
According to R.D. Matthews, Susanna Moody's 1852 memoir, A Journey into the Woods, details her journey as a settler in Upper Canada, specifically rural Ontario. On the other hand, the government of New Brunswick provides details of Oliver Goldsmith's 1825 fictional poem, The Rising Village, which presents a fictionalized account of colonial settlement in Nova Scotia.
Okay. And although both authors employ literary devices such as juxtaposition, imagery, and personification, their portrayals of the Canadian wilderness differ, which speaks to the nuanced depictions of how early settlers navigated the relationship with the land.
Moody's A Journey into the Woods depicts her experience as an outsider, her anxiety, and her view of the wilderness as an uncontrollable force, establishing nature as a threat to identity. In contrast, in Goldsmith's The Rising Village, the narrator positions settlers as creators, confident, while viewing the wilderness as an exploitable resource, portraying nature as an imagined site for colonial progress.
Yeah, these divergent attitudes toward the land encapsulate Arthur Fry's analyses of settler reactions to Canadian wilderness. He notes the terror settlers felt towards the vast unconsciousness of nature, while also identifying the conquest of nature by an intelligence that does not love it. The two works align with different aspects of the garrison mentality. Moody's work emphasizes fear of life outside the garrison, while Goldsmith's work highlights the desire to build the garrison.
Alright, so before we get into part 1 of our deep dive, it is imperative to mention that both authors' narratives function on the settler colonial mindset of terra nullius, the idea that the land is unoccupied and available for settlement, because this assumption works in tandem with the garrison mentality.
Goldsmith's narrator, for example, describes the land as bleak and desert, which reinforces the notion of an empty wilderness awaiting transformation. Similarly, Moody remarks that there are no ghosts in Canada, the country is too new for ghosts, which would suggest an absence of history or prior inhabitants.
Yeah, and the idea ties directly into Patrick Wolf's argument. He notes the distinction between dominion, which inherit in European sovereigns alone, and natives' right of occupancy. Essentially, what Wolf is saying is that settlers viewed themselves as the only legitimate claimants of the land.
And that is where Fry's garrison mentality comes in. He describes early Canadian settlers as perceiving the environment in 19th century Canada as empty and vast. This perception justified the need for settlement, which reinforced the colonial project by framing the land as something to secure against the perceived wilderness.
Alright, let's dive into part 1 of this in-depth exploration, where we will discuss how Moody positions herself as an outsider to the land. Her storytelling really emphasizes how the Canadian wilderness poses a threat to identity.
Right, she juxtaposes her past life in England with the unfamiliarity of the Canadian landscape, specifically through the cedar swamp and her dislike of the food, as well as the lack of tea and bread.
Oh, absolutely. Let's dive into how Moody's reaction to the cedar swamp reflects her sense of alienation. She states that the swamp is a gloomy spot. In the old country, superstition would people it with ghosts.
Yeah, this comparison juxtaposes her present unsettling surroundings with the familiar and comforting landscape of, as she states, her old country, which only intensifies her sense of being an outsider in the Canadian wilderness.
And it is not just the landscape that reinforces this sense of alienation. Her struggle to adapt extends to food, which of course is a major marker of identity and comfort. She expresses distaste for the available food, calling the pritters and pork salty, hard, and unsavory.
Yeah, and her longing for, as she states, a cup of tea and a slice of bread really drives home that disconnection. These small, everyday objects would have been second nature to her back home, but in Canada, their absence is a constant reminder that she is in an unfamiliar place.
That's a great way to put it. This sense of engulfment by an unknown landscape actually ties into Fry's analysis of the experiences of many early settlers through the lens of the garrison mentality. He argues that to enter Canada is a matter of being silently swallowed by an alien continent.
And Moody's experience fits that idea perfectly. She confronts an environment alien to what she has previously experienced.
Okay, recap. Moody's portrayal of the Canadian wilderness underscores her sense of being an outsider as she contrasts her former life in England with the disorienting realities of the Canadian landscape, from the cedar swamp to the unfamiliar food. Alright, so we have talked about how Moody presents herself as an outsider to the land, but Goldsmith takes a completely different approach. The narrator frames settlers as creators as he envisions the wilderness as a land for colonial advancement.
There's definitely a lot to unpack. The narrator juxtaposes the untouched wilderness with future ambition, specifically through the creation of cottages and the harnessing of the stream.
Starting with the creation of housing. The narrator emphasizes this transformation through the mention that the land was once pine, but the settlers' humble cottages are now spread on this land.
Right, that contrast is crucial. The pine represents the untouched wilderness, while the cottages signify human transformation. Rather than simply inhabiting the land, settlers impose order through creation.
Of course, and building on that, this act of creation extends beyond housing. The narrator envisions the transformation of natural elements into tools for civilization.
Wow, that is a great point. The narrator talks about the winding stream that turns the busy mill, which becomes a part of a deliberately crafted world. This contrast between the natural, unaltered stream and its industrial use reinforces the settler's role as a creator.
Hold on, tell me more.
Of course, this idea of the settler as a creator actually connects to a larger literary discussion, and one that contrasts with the garrison mentality's often isolating and defensive thinking, which frames the wilderness as an alien threat. Eli Mandel suggests that the land does not determine the literature. Instead, he argues that the writer invents the land. He describes the environment as a mental construct, a region of the mind.
And this sense of invention is exactly what the narrator is doing. His depiction of the land is an interpretation. The cottages and mills are manifestations of the settler's vision for what the land should be.
Fascinating.
Okay, cap off part 1 of this in-depth exploration. Moody presents herself as an outsider to the land, while Goldsmith's narrator presents settlers as creators. The narrator juxtaposes the untouched Canadian landscape with the creation of cottages and the harnessing of the stream. Alright, for part 2 of this in-depth exploration, let's look at how Moody conveys her anxiety about the land. Her writing illustrates how the Canadian wilderness threatens personal identity.
Yeah, and she uses powerful imagery in her descriptions of the dense woods and her moments of doubt about settling on this land, which paint a vivid picture of emotional turmoil.
There is definitely a lot to unpack. Let's start with Moody's description of the woods. She asserts that all regrets were now useless. She was unconscious of the life of toil and anxiety that awaited her in those dreadful woods.
Moody's choice of dreadful woods in her description is key here. It creates a depiction of an ominous atmosphere. The feeling is not just about the physical landscape, but also symbolizes the hardship and uncertainty that lie.
Right, and this sense of unease builds through her writing. Later, Moody describes how a foreboding sadness sunk upon her heart. She retraced step by step the pilgrimage of her past life.
That phrase foreboding sadness really stands out, as it is not just a passing emotion. It is something that holds much weight, something that lingers. It reinforces how disconnected Moody feels from this new environment.
Exactly, that is a great way to put it. And then there is this moment of raw doubt when she gazed through tears upon the singularly savage scene around her, and secretly marveled what brought her here.
Of course, and Moody's choice of a savage scene highlights the overwhelming nature of the wilderness, how it feels untamed, even hostile. And her tearful gaze suggests a breaking point, a moment of deep regret and apprehension.
Yay. Okay, to recap, Moody's depiction of the Canadian wilderness emphasizes her overwhelming anxiety. Through vivid imagery of the dense woods and her doubts about settling, she paints a clear picture of emotional turmoil. Alright, while Moody expresses overwhelming anxiety about the land, Goldsmith, however, takes a strikingly different stance. The narrator exudes confidence in shaping the land, whereby he conceptualizes the Canadian wilderness as a space ripe for colonial growth.
Oh, absolutely. The narrator uses vivid imagery to depict colonial triumph over nature and celebrate its transformation into a flourishing space.
Okay, unpack. Let's start with the example of how the narrator envisions agricultural success. He states that the forest, once its foliage spread, the golden corn triumphant waves its head.
The narrator vividly depicts the settler's ability to convert wilderness into farmland. He frames this transformation as a victory. The word triumphant reinforces the concept that agriculture represents progress over the untamed landscape, whereby there is an inherent colonial confidence in the celebratory process.
Hold on, tell me more.
Gerald Lynch, in his article, expands on this idea of colonial confidence in his analysis of the Rising Village, where he asserts that the wilderness is transformed, control is exerted, order is imposed. The pioneer then finds time to relax, the one pastime that Goldsmith portrays throughout the poem.
Wow, that is a great point, and this idea reinforces the colonial mindset, whereby individuals subdue the land. Lynch's mention of the pioneer's ability to relax suggests that the settlers have won their battle against nature, achieving a level of confidence where leisure becomes possible.
And this confidence carries through to the narrator's vision of the future when he mentions that thy years increase, thy glories rise, to be the wonder of the western skies. The phrase glories rise creates a powerful image of expansion and success. The narrator envisions a grand, inevitable future of prosperity, which reinforces his confidence in what is to come from settler dominance over the land.
Yeah, those are great insights. Alright, to wrap up and conclude part 2 of this comprehensive examination, Moody expresses overwhelming anxiety about the land, while Goldsmith's narrator depicts settler confidence in shaping it. The narrator uses vivid imagery to celebrate the colonial triumph over nature and its transformation into a productive space.
Before we proceed, a quick message from your favorite sponsor. Thinking of settling in the Canadian wilderness? Introducing the Moody and Goldsmith Survival Guide. Step 1, panic. Step 2, write about it. Order now and get one free of charge.
Alright, for part 3 of this in-depth exploration, let's examine Moody's view of the land as an uncontrollable force, whereby the Canadian wilderness poses a significant challenge to one's sense of self.
Yeah, it definitely uses personification to bring the landscape to life. She describes the towering woods and the Otonabee River as imposing and untamed.
Okay, start with how Moody describes the forest. She states that tall woods arose on either side of the path, their solemn aspect, and the deep silence that brooded over their vast solitudes, inspiring the mind with a strange awe.
Moody's mention of the tall woods rising really stands out. It suggests that the trees have a will of their own and appear without human intervention. The solemn aspect and deep silence add to the sense of mystery. It evokes something ancient and beyond control.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And this theme continues in Moody's description of the Otonabee River. She describes it as the dark, rushing, foaming river, flying madly on its course that shakes with thundering force. The theme of nature having its own will continues. As the river is wild and untamed, it flies madly and shakes as if it has a mind of its own. These descriptions emphasize its immense power, which reinforces the concept that settlers can never fully control the wilderness.
Yeah, this idea of the Canadian wilderness as an uncontrollable force connects to Fry's concept of the garrison mentality. He describes the Canadian wilderness as having the unrealized, the humanly undigested built into it, and calls it the unseizable virginity. Fry's use of unseizable virginity suggests that the land resists human attempts to fully understand or conquer it. Moody's writing reflects this tension. Settlers may try to establish control, but the wilderness remains something ultimately indifferent to their presence.
Alright, so to summarize, Moody portrays the land as an uncontrollable force. She uses personification to depict the towering woods and the Otonabee River as imposing and untamed. In contrast to Moody, who portrays the land as an uncontrollable force, Goldsmith takes a drastically different perspective. His narrator views the Canadian wilderness as an exploitable resource and an envisioned tool for colonial conquest.
Exactly. The narrator uses personification to attribute purpose and intent to the marsh as an expansive, untapped terrain, primed for future development, and the fir trees as evolving into a communal space.
Alright, let's break this idea down and begin with the narrator's description of the marsh. He asserts that the broad marsh extends its open plain. By describing the marsh as something that extends itself, the narrator personifies and attributes it with intent, as if the marsh is actively expanding and preparing for future development.
Exactly, and we see this concept again in the narrator's description of fir trees. The broad fir trees, once sheltered from the storm, by slow degrees a neighborhood they form.
Yeah, definitely. The narrator personifies the fir trees, suggesting they once actively sheltered from storms, but now contribute to human settlement as they give way to a growing community. This transformation illustrates the exploitation of natural resources to sustain human habitation.
Wow, that is a great point. And this concept ties directly into Wolff's argument about settler colonialism. In his article, he asserts that agriculture is not just an economic activity, it symbolizes the settlers' deep connection to the land and their need to exploit it for survival. He claims that it is a symbolic cornerstone of settler identity. Though Wolff's argument primarily focuses on agriculture as a symbol of settler colonial identity, we can see how the narrator actively frames the Canadian wilderness as a space for transformation. He shapes it into a resource for human use and settlement.
Okay, we'll cap off part 3 of this in-depth exploration. While Moody sees the land as an uncontrollable force, Goldsmith's narrator presents it as an exploitable resource for settlers. Through personification, the narrator depicts the marsh as ripe for development and the fir trees as evolving into a communal space. Alright, to conclude this episode, let's recap. Although both authors employ literary devices such as juxtaposition, imagery, and personification in their descriptions of the Canadian wilderness, Moody and Goldsmith diverge in their portrayals of settler relations to the land.
Yeah, Moody takes her experience as an outsider, her anxiety, and her view of the wilderness as an uncontrollable force, establishing nature as a threat to identity. In contrast, Goldsmith presents a fictionalized account of colonial settlement, where the narrator frames settlers as creators, confident, whereby they view the wilderness as an exploitable resource, portraying nature as an imagined site for colonial progress.
Yeah, and these divergent attitudes align with different aspects of Fry's garrison mentality. Moody's work emphasizes fear of life outside the garrison, while Goldsmith's work highlights the desire to build the garrison.
Moreover, by creating this podcast, our goal was to offer a lens beyond this idea. The relationship between settlers and the land, particularly the narratives used to justify its exploitation, establishes a foundation for modern discussions on environmental issues.
This legacy persists through the Canadian government and, by extension, exploitative industries like many pipeline companies, which continue to frame resource extraction as a necessary benefit. The establishment of settler communities ultimately laid the groundwork for Canada's ongoing environmental challenges. They inform current conversations around how settler colonial legacies persist in shaping modern attitudes toward land and the environment, seen through the lens of resource extraction and land use conflicts. I'm your host, Mehdi, signing out. Thank you for listening.